Hi everyone, this is Ryan. This is video 1 of my playlist of Advanced Connect 4 theory. So, Connect 4 is actually a solved game. Whoever plays first can always win. However, there are approximately 4.5 trillion possible games of Connect 4. So you're not going to be able to just memorize every possible position. So, in this series, I'm going to try to teach you some patterns and give you some tools so that, to the best of your ability, you can approximate perfect play. This first video is mainly going to cover the fundamental strategy that you're going for with Connect 4, as well as establish some basic vocabulary and terms that we'll be using throughout the rest of the series. With this tool that I'm using, link to the website in the description. First player is always red, and second player is always yellow. So throughout the rest of the series, I'm going to use the words red and first player interchangeably, and yellow and second player interchangeably, sometimes referring to the color instead of the explicit player will make it easier to visualize some of the exact math and some of the patterns that I'm going to be explaining. Also, for this series, we're going to be borrowing from chess notation. You'll probably have noticed the letters and numbers around the outside of the board. So this is going to help me explain to you exactly where I'm playing and why. So, for example, if I say we're going to play on the A1 square, I mean here. If I say we're going to play on the G3 square, I mean here. If I say we're going to play up the B column, then I mean up here. So the other major terms to cover are major and minor threat. This is really going to be the meat of the strategy, manipulating threats to control the game. So there are two types of threats, major threat and minor threat. Let's go into some examples to show you exactly what those terms mean. So a major threat is any set of 3 disks where there's only one disk left to make a Connect 4. For example, this right here is a major threat along the 3rd row, and this right here is a major threat along the diagonal, and it doesn't necessarily need to be all in a row. Here is a major threat along the diagonal where the last disk needing to be placed is here in the 2nd row. So next is minor threats. So using minor threats to control the game is a lot less intuitive than major threats. So minor threats are going to get their own entire video later on in the series, but I'm just going to cover them briefly here so you know what I'm talking about. So a minor threat is a 2 in a row that has the potential to become a 4 in a row. So, for example, this is a red minor threat here, and this is a yellow minor threat here, and then we have 2 red diagonal minor threats and a yellow minor threat here. And again, we'll cover this more extensively in a later video. So now that we've covered the basic terminology, let's get to the fundamental strategy of Connect 4. So at its most basic, Connect 4 is a game about parity. In mathematics, parity means the state of being odd or even. If you play first, your goal is to achieve an odd row major threat. And if you're playing second, your goal is to achieve an even row major threat. Now, I promise I'm going to make that make sense. let's get into some examples so that I can show you what I mean by that. So by odd and even row, I mean the numbers along the rows here. So odd rows are 1, 3, and 5, and even rows are 2, 4, and 6. So we can see that red has a major threat here where the last disk that red needs to place is on the third row. That makes this an odd row major threat, which for red is a winning threat. So this is also the same if the threat is diagonal. And so even though we have disks on the 1 through 4th row, the only one that matters is the last empty disk that you need to win. And so we can see in this example that yellow has a major threat here along the 2nd row, where, and this is technically 2 major threats. We have one right here at B2 and one right here at F2, making this an even row major threat. And in this position, this is a winning threat for yellow. So by now you're probably wondering, why does this matter? Why should I care? Why does red want an odd row threat, and why does yellow want an even row threat? What is the difference? Why do they want different things? And how does this matter to winning? So let's take a look. So the reason that red wants odd row threats and yellow wants even row threats is because if you fill up the entire rest of the board, then on the last column, on this first square, it's going to be first player's turn. So what this means is if you're first player and you have a threat on an odd row, then you get to place the disc there and you win. Conversely, if you're second player, it's going to be your turn on all of the even rows. And so you're going to get to play there. And so in this position, red has all of the even rows and yellow has all of the odds. So it's a draw. So see, first, second, first, second, first, second. If that didn't immediately make sense, don't worry about it. We're going to be covering constant examples of threats at play and how they matter toward winning. So just hold on through these examples, and I'm sure through repetition and different kinds of examples, it'll become clear. So you may remember at the beginning of the video, I said that first player can always win. So that's because unless there are some extra factors that I'll go into in later videos, if first player gets an odd row major threat and second player gets an even row major threat, then first player's threat still wins anyway. To explain why this is, we just need to go over some basics of turn order and parity. So, there are 42 squares on a Connect 4 board. And at the beginning, there are 42 empty squares on a Connect 4 board. And it's first player's turn. So now, there are 41 empty squares on the board. And it's second player's turn. So this may seem obvious, but It matters for the middle game in that you can figure out whose turn it is by whether or not there is an odd or even number of empty squares on the board. If there are an even number of empty squares on the board, then it's first player's turn. If there are an odd number of empty squares on the board, it's second player's turn. Also, as I have clearly marked, there are 6 squares per column. So whenever we have a full column, that puts us back at square one, and it is first player's turn. All right, so let's get into why this move order lets first player win anyway. So in this example, we can see a few major threats on the board. Now, something to note about major threats is that they freeze the number of discs on that row to their same parity. What I mean by that is, let's look at yellow's 4th row major threat. So if red ever plays here, yellow's just going to immediately win. And so columns are frozen 2 discs below, where neither player is going to play right under it, because yellow would then let red block and give up the threat, and red would just immediately lose. So let's use the lesson that we just learned to figure out whose turn is it in this position. So we can disregard full columns because they're all even. These set us back to square one, and it's just first player's turn. So we're just going to look at the columns where there are still discs left to be played. So the B, E, and F columns. Now, as we just covered, yellow has a even row major threat for the B and E columns. And so, like we said, even row threats freeze the column as even, odd row threats freeze the column as odd. So now let's take a look at red's odd row threat. So because yellow freezes the B and E column over here as even, then it's just left to the F column to change it either way. So there is 1 disc here, and so every other column is even, and there's this 1 disc here, so the overall parity of the board is odd. There are an odd number of empty squares on the board, so it is second player's turn. Alright, so why do we care whose turn it is? So in this example, first player has an odd row threat, and second player has an even row threat. Both players have achieved their basic goal. However, all of the columns are frozen. If either player plays in any of the columns, they're either going to give up their threat or they're going to allow the other player to win. And so, since it's second player's turn, they don't want to go here, or else they just lose. And so their only choice is to give up one of their threats, here and here. So let's go ahead and we'll give up this one. Red blocks. All of the columns are still locked, while the B and the F columns are locked. So we're just going to keep playing up here. Now, we're in the same position. all of the columns are full, except for where yellow has an even threat and red has an odd threat. And so, because the overall parity of the board is odd, it is still second player's turn. And they still don't want to go at f2, so they'll give up their threat over here. And now, because it is still odd, it's still second player's turn. So he has to go here and let red win on his odd row threat. Now, if you're second player and you've accidentally let first player establish an odd row major threat, the game isn't necessarily over. There is one thing that you can do to try to refute first player and take back control of the game. And that's by getting your own odd row threat. So getting an odd row threat as second player isn't going to win the game. However, you can use it to negate first player's odd row threat. Let's show how this math works out. So, in this example, we can see a few major threats on the board. Yellow has an odd row major threat here on the 5th row, and red has an odd row major threat here on the 3rd row. And so red has achieved their primary goal of the game, but yellow has not achieved their primary goal of the game. But they do have an opposing odd row threat. Now, because there are two odd row threats canceling each other out, and yellow doesn't have an even row threat anywhere else, this is actually a draw. So, why do they cancel each other out? So, let's go back to our lessons about turn order and parity and frozen columns to try to figure this one out. And so, we can, again, disregard all full columns. They're all even. They all set us back to square one with an even board. So we're just going to look at the C and the E columns. Now, both of them are frozen, and they're frozen odd because there is an odd row major threat on each one. Now, because they're both odd, an odd plus an odd is an even. So, the overall parity of the board is even. Therefore, it is first player's turn. Now, since it's first player's turn, they're going to have to give up their odd row threat in the C column. And they still don't want to play on the E column, or else they just lose. So they finish playing up the column. And now, because this is an odd row threat for yellow and not an even row threat, this doesn't win, but it does tie. So, an important note about this rule of odds canceling each other out is that second player's odd row threat that's doing the canceling out needs to be in a different column. Why should be fairly clear. This odd plus this odd in the C and E columns together make the overall parity of the board even. And so it is first player's turn here, and he has to give up this threat. And so if yellow's was here on this 5th row, and on the same column, then this one column is odd, and it is second player's turn here, and red just wins. And so separate columns to cancel each other out. So with these rules, you have a fundamental understanding of the goals of Connect 4 and the basics on why they're the goals of Connect 4. And just mastering these can make you a much stronger player, let you beat most of your friends at the game most of the time. At the same time, we've barely scratched the surface. There are exceptions to all of these rules and a lot more to learn. There's a lot of patterns, a lot of strategies, minor threats, etc. And so stay with me for the rest of this series to become a Connect 4 master. Please subscribe and thanks for watching.